Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director of the Orchestre National de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive into this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Dirk, David, Gladys, and Paul, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/stickynotespodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please just take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. This week, I am in Lille with the Orchestre National de Lille, doing a really fun program of French and American music. We're doing Ravel's La Valse, Ravel's Le Tombeau de Couperin, and Gershwin's Concerto in F, along with Ives' Three Places in New England, the piece we talked about last week. For this week's episode, I've got an old episode, and it's from the pandemic era when I was doing 2 episodes a week. And usually one of those episodes was an interview, and in this case, I interviewed the great American composer Caroline Shaw. We talked about composing through the pandemic, lots of things about being away and being not able to see people, so some of that is a little bit outdated. And I'm sitting here with my daughter right now recording this. She almost made it through this whole thing. And it was a really, really fun conversation also about her compositional process, so I decided to bring it back in this American series. Thanks so much, and really hope you enjoy this interview with Caroline Shaw. So Caroline Shaw, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Josh.
How are you doing, and where are you right now?
I'm doing okay, and I'm in Amherst, Massachusetts right now.
Have you been there the whole time?
I've been here most of the time, but I'm spending a little time in my apartment in New York, which is in Hell's Kitchen, which is sort of surrounded by everything. Normally it's full of tourists and theater goers, and now it's just people in the neighborhood. So.
Have you been working a lot during this time off from performing, or has it been sort of a different kind of experience for you?
I took a lot of time off in the very beginning. I think the first month I just, this is a crazy time. I think it's important to acknowledge that, and I spent a lot of time just reading news. I suddenly subscribed to 4 newspapers, and wasn't writing and certainly wasn't performing. And then allowing myself to change. I think that's sort of important. If there's a sort of once in a lifetime moment to kind of reflect deeply on a lot of things, this is that time. So, and now I'm getting, now it's August, and I'm getting much more back in the swing of things. There are a lot of different kinds of writing projects that are floating around that I'm getting back into.
Right. Do you have any performances that are scheduled coming up, or do you know when your next performance is supposed to be?
I have a big premiere in Copenhagen in September, which I probably won't go to, and another sort of semi-premiere in Holland that I also cannot go to. So it's a lot of things that I know are can happen in Europe, but I won't be leaving the country. So right. I don't think my sense is that I won't perform or do anything for quite a while, but you take things as they come, and I feel there's always something positive to find in it. And mostly I'm just, concerned for friends and looking forward to being in a room together with people. Although actually, you know what, but I do have a real thing next week, which is I'm recording a bunch of music with the Ataka String Quartet in New York. So that's in a room together making music.
Hey, that's great. That's really nice. I haven't had a chance to do that yet. I'm supposed to be in September in Lausanne, and then performing one of your pieces in October in Liverpool. But, hopefully everything will happen. But I find it just totally bizarre that the fact that I've moved to London makes it possible for me to do these concerts, because if I was in the U.S. right now, there's travel bans all over Europe for Americans, which is pretty surreal at this point, that the mythical American passport, which can get you just about anywhere in the world, suddenly can get you to 4 countries right now. Yeah, it's bleak. Anyway, so just to go back to the beginning somewhat, what was your upbringing like in terms of music?
I want to ask you the same thing because your upbringing is really interesting.
Okay, sure. That's fine.
But for mine, I grew up in Greenville, North Carolina, and my mom was a Suzuki violin teacher, and my dad's an amateur pianist, doctor, and I had two older brothers who played violin. So I grew up just hearing all the songs, and then 3 years later, I'd be playing them. So things came pretty easily, I think, as a violinist. And I always thought that I was going to be play in a string quartet, play in an orchestra, be a violinist. And then I started kind of over time singing more. I sang in church choir and then writing music as I got older. But it was a very, I think the only music that I listened to was classical music, and wasn't forced to. It was just those were the CDs and the cassette tapes that I had around. So I fell in love with opera really deeply when I was maybe 10 or 11, and fell in love with chamber music. And I think once I played in a string quartet with friends, that was it for me. This is the best thing in the world. So that was what I was very serious about and was doing for a long time.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, so I grew up hearing music like all the time, obviously. And then what's funny is we had classical music and the Beatles. Those were like the two things that were in the house. It was either it was like Beethoven or the Beatles, or Schumann and the Beatles. And I felt like that was like my mom grew up in the 60s and had all of like the 60s music around her all the time, but really only retained loving the Beatles into her time as a professional classical musician. And then, I had a similar experience with chamber music. I had sort of just about decided to do music when I was on this youth orchestra tour in Panama and Guatemala. And then I went to the Greenwood Music Camp in Western Massachusetts, and which just about every musician finds their time there. And I I was there, and I was playing some quartet, and I just sort of popped into my head, why would I want to do anything else than this? And of course, then I ended up as a conductor, which is very different from chamber music entirely. But it was definitely I had a similar sort of epiphany moment with chamber music.
And your violin is your primary instrument. Yeah. For me, it was Kinhaven, which is just up the road from Greenwood.
Exactly. So, it was there was this weird, friendly, competitive vibe between Kinhaven and Greenwood, that if you went to Kinhaven, you would say that Kinhaven's the greatest, and if you went to Greenwood, you'd say Greenwood was the greatest. But there was no real reason. We were all just a bunch of high school kids who were very unusual because we all just wanted to play quartets all day. And it was a very unusual summer experience for a kid, I think.
Josh, what is the name? In Greenwood, you have a name for reading chamber music, which I think is zilching.
Zilching.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This is a legendary word among Greenwood kids.
Yeah, zilching, which means that you had no zilch time to prepare or do anything. So you would just grab music out of the library, and people would read. I mean, the structure was set up so that you would have concerts on Saturday where you would play a movement of a great work of the past, or on more and more they started to introduce living composers' works and more unusual things. But what people did most of the time was not rehearse their piece for the concert. They just read constantly. I mean, we would do hours and hours and hours and hours, and people would sneak out of their cabins at night, not to drink. They went to go read more chamber music. But nowadays, you're everything. You're a vocalist, violinist, composer, producer, and you sort of exploded onto the scene with the Partita for 8 Voices and the Pulitzer Prize. We talked about this before, but I wanted to ask you, on this show, what did that prize mean for you in terms of your other work, as a violinist and a vocalist? Because all of a sudden you were known as composer Caroline Shaw.
Yeah, it was a strange day when that happened, because a lot of even some of my friends didn't know that I wrote music. I had only just joined the Princeton composition program and had really been a freelance singer in New York for a long time and freelance violinist. And I also kept those worlds pretty separate. So people didn't know that I did the other thing. Anyway, I never really identified as a composer, sort of capital C composer. It was just something that I was doing. I would just make music with, for friends or for a concert that we had, and hadn't really gone through the same exact schooling, hadn't really had a composition teacher. And I also feel like, it can be kind of, it can be an exclusive word. It sort of seems to apply only to a certain genre or a certain community of musicians, but, there are musicians who are in bands or in hip hop and all kinds of music who just call themselves musicians or producers or creators or something. So anyway, I still use the word composer every so often, but it's one of the different sort of variety of things that I do. Also at that time, that was 2013, I hadn't really written very much music. And including like part of that piece was I used to apply to grad school. So I didn't have a lot of music under my belt. I didn't really know if I could write music on commission. I didn't know what would come out or if I'd ever be able to do it. And I kind of figured that, okay, I've written this one thing and that's the thing, and I may not do this much anymore. But now it's 7 years later, and it's a lot of what I do, and I really like it.
Well,
I think I like making up music. I've always liked it, and just feels like a different kind of painting or choreography. Like I know I'll never get to be a choreographer, probably won't really be a painter, but music is the thing that I get to work with. So I feel really lucky about that.
That's great. Did you, when you had to apply for the prize, right? So did you submit a piece?
Yeah, so ballsy. It cost $50 to apply. I remember thinking about this. Like, and to apply to each grad school was $75 to $100. So it was just sort of the way I thought about it in my mind. And also at the time, Roomful of Teeth was we had just started. It was a group of 8 singers that I'm a part of that was founded by Brad Wells. And we weren't as well known, and I thought it would be really great for this music to get out there. Otherwise, we won't ever perform it again unless someone knows about it. So I thought I'll just send this in. Someone will listen to it, and I think you never know what it can do. Just in terms of having some ears on on what we do. And then it was kind of a surprise several months later when the prize was announced.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious how your experience was, because I applied for a conducting competition like on a lark when I was 21, and then I went and won, and all of a sudden had like all these concerts, and people were writing nasty articles about me on the internet, and some, of course, nice ones as well. But, I remember, even though I had grown up in music, that, there were managers coming up to me, talking to me, and I, called my parents, and I was like, oh my God, these managers came up to me and were asking me about my career. I've never conducted a professional orchestra before. And my parents were like, yeah, that's kind of what happens when this kind of thing happens. And, then, of course, I was really lucky because they were able to kind of walk me through the whole process. But it was certainly overwhelming to have all of a sudden all of this attention. And now, as you said, 7 years later, you're being commissioned by everybody, and everybody, including me, are just begging you to write music for them. And can it be overwhelming at times, or have you learned that you do like writing on commission, or do you feel like it's not natural enough in a way?
I think as long as there's a balance, I like assignments, and I like challenges, and I like deadlines. I think I'm a person who would never get anything done if I didn't have a deadline, and I'm pretty clear about I know that about myself. So having and also having restrictions and parameters, and having the chance to write for people who are wanting to do something is I think is really great. But at the same time, I like to have a few other projects that don't really fit in the box, that are kind of not commissioned exactly, that I'm working on slowly and that develop as they are. So as long as I have a few different ways of working going on, if I feel great. If one sort of overtakes the other, then it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I've always loved your music, and I find it so inventive and beautiful. And I was just reading, because I'm doing this Beethoven cycle, so I'm trying to gobble up as much Beethoven as I can right now. And, I read in biographies about Beethoven that he really, even though he was really crotchety about when people didn't like his music, he really did desire people to love it. And I think he really had this sort of like, he wasn't composing just for himself. He really wanted people to hear his music, and he was one of the first composers who wanted a legacy, et cetera, et cetera.
Huh.
Do you feel, and then other composers, of course, famously like Milton Babbitt writing Who Cares If You Listen? So do you feel like you fall into one of those categories, like writing for yourself or writing, to the people, and or does it change piece to piece or moment to moment?
I mean, I think there's some, at some level it changes piece to piece, but I definitely fall way more in the, like, I do want people to like the music. I mean, I write for myself. I want to like the music, and I grew up as a, classical music listener, a listener of music on the radio, and I deeply love music, and I want to make something that I would also enjoy. And but also you can't write for everyone. So I know that if I, write a certain kind of piece, some people in the audience might love it and some will hate it, and that's okay. You have to kind of get through that. But if I always think of if, as a chef, if you're cook, or if you're just cooking a meal for someone, you want them to like the meal, and you also want it to be, healthy and nourishing and not toxic, and maybe is also for that meal to be just the background to like another conversation about something else. Like maybe the meal is just a vehicle for people to have conversations with each other, and I think that's also okay for music. I mean, there's great music that I love that is, it has different levels of foreground and background. I also like making music that feels like I love it on the surface, but then if you look closer, if you listen more closely, there are all these little conversations and details that are like that are in there, but it's not the most important thing. Like the program note is not the most important thing, but there are things to like sort of enjoy on multiple levels.
Here's Caroline Shaw and the Ataka Quartet performing Caroline's And So.
Would a song by any other name sound as sweet and true? Would all the reds be just the same, or violets as blue?
Yeah, and like things to uncover inside of it. Yeah. I found with, I've conducted two of your pieces, the Entr'acte and the Watermark, the piano concerto for Jonathan Biss. And Watermark was only once, but Entr'acte I've done now like 11 or 12 times, and in so many different countries. And I find it so interesting because so often with musicians, and, conductors are not immune to this, orchestral musicians, chamber musicians, the first reaction is something new because we're such a genre that worships the old so much. Anything new is so often met with skepticism. And something I noticed with Entr'acte is that there's these two extended technique things which are quite easy to explain, and as soon as they're explained it makes total sense. So there's like skepticism to that, and then once they're explained, I always get this like surprised reaction when we get to the end of the piece because people are like, wow, I really like that. And it's very strange to, it's kind of, I mean, I'm happy that people love your piece. And then I always wish that there could be another, there could be more openness right from the start, because I think people see something new and they just doubt it right away instead of being open to it from the start. And, I guess, part of that is that you get to perform your own pieces as well. So you're overcoming the skepticism as you write it and perform it. But, when you have a piece like, say, Entr'acte performed, you are sort of releasing it into the wild in a certain sense. Do you sometimes want to hold on to them, the pieces that you're not performing, or are you kind of excited to see how everyone approaches them differently?
It depends on the piece. With Entr'acte, I love seeing all, like, that is a piece for anybody to do. Like even the reason for writing it was to write a piece for a string quartet that's used to playing Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn, to like play something new, and there's some shared language in there, but then you can make what you want of it. And the same way that you discuss how much vibrato do you use, what are the articulations, how far, do you go for forte and piano, all those things that we feel like we can discuss in Beethoven and Mozart, you can make what you want in new music too. Like even if I'm alive, it's not, I don't need to control it anymore. There's some other pieces that I'm a little bit more, just hold a little bit closer, just because there are things that I know that without kind of clear explanation of the origins or something that might not work. But music's for people to make together, and I really think that's also why I write music, is for people to like, pull off the shelf and zilch and then just enjoy doing something together.
Here's the Calidor String Quartet with Caroline Shaw's Entr'acte. Yeah, I love that in your music, because I feel like you're very clear and direct. And then, I remember writing to you when I was doing it with Philadelphia, and I wrote, a couple questions, and it was the first time you actually heard me conduct it.
Yeah.
And I was like, I didn't tell you, I was so nervous, not to conduct Philadelphia Orchestra, but to have you in the audience. I was like, oh my God, I've done this piece so many times. What if I've been butchering it this whole time?
It was gorgeous. It was beautiful, but it was also really exciting. It was my first time going down to, I took the train down to Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Orchestra with Josh Weilerstein. It was super exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just find it like I'm not a composer. I wrote songs in high school for my rock band, and I just find it such an interesting process of letting something go into the world. I was just writing a show about the Brahms Requiem, and there's this story of the third movement of the Requiem. The first performance was a disaster, and it got terrible reviews, which Brahms didn't often get, because the timpani player misread a forte piano at the end of the big fugue, at the end of the third movement, and played it fortissimo the whole time. So he just drowned everybody out. Oh. And so the reviewer was like, it sounded like I was going through a train tunnel, you couldn't hear anything. And I always just imagine, for a composer to just let your music out in the world. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to be specific, but have there been experiences where you've had a piece that you've let go of and then kind of been upset or disappointed in how it was performed?
Yeah, it's usually with students. So there's an aspect of total forgiveness there. And again, I don't think that, what I feel is the most important thing, but there'll be this feeling of oh, I was not clear enough in this, it was my fault. I was not clear enough about this, or I hadn't realized what was a salient point in that phrase that I should have specified that it should rise and fall. And, but I still think that the world is better if you let things go and let people make some of their own decisions rather than be disappointed. Life's too short to be sad about music, It's just let it go. But then also, makes you think about, I think a lot about musical community. And if I'm, I originally started making music for people who I literally knew, who were around me, who I was playing with. And then once it becomes, you become removed from that. Yes, it's exciting and it's prestigious to have music kind of go around the world, but it's a different kind of musical community. But the best things are when people have conversations and they make a decision. And if someone happens to make a quote unquote wrong decision, maybe there's something interesting there. Yeah.
And when
I'm trying to think if there's a case where I felt really, really. Sometimes, okay, I will say. Sometimes I hear singers sing my music that, and the voice is so particular. And my number one is that everyone has their own voice. They have their own way of singing, and nothing is wrong. Everything is valid. Everything's on the table. But if I've written a phrase in a certain way meant to be sung in a sort of maybe more casual way, and then it becomes very formal, that feels, it's uncomfortable for me, but it's something that I know that it happens, and it's okay.
Well, I mean, you previewed the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that you perform so much of your own music as a singer. And, sometimes I listen to you sing with any of your pieces, and I can't imagine hearing another singer sing it. And you have performers that you're really associated with, like the Ataka Quartet, who you mentioned. But, in terms of the vocal music, when you're performing it, do you think of it as a performer or as a composer during a performance of that kind of music? Of your music, I should say.
Oh, my music. Yeah, it depends on if it's singing. I mean, I think I always write. I can't help but write with my voice. Kind of, it's just how I write with my voice in mind, unintentionally, not intentionally, but it's always part of it. But then I guess this question, like, what is a composer? I just think of it as being like I'm designing a recipe and a game and a set of parameters and set of ingredients and set of things for people to do. And I can be very specific about what I want them to do, or I can sort of let it go. There's a piece that I've played. It's basically a violin concerto that I'm the only person who's played it because I never wrote the part down. Because when I first premiered it, I wasn't entirely sure what it was going to be, but I had to send the music to the orchestra like a month or two before. So I just sent them that. I was like, well, this is set. I don't really know what my part's going to be. and over time now, I think I play it 95% the same way every time, but I really, I still have played that piece, and I've never revised the score. And the conductor is always like, so what are you going to do here? You're doing something totally different. There's an aspect of like, the composer performer, they're really tied closely together. If I'm writing, for another performer like Jonathan Biss, Watermark, piece you've conducted, I also still can't help but feel the part in my own hands as a mediocre pianist, but like the shape of the music that I love to play. And the spacing of that is very much a part of the writing, also unintentionally. But I like to think about if there's a specific performer, thinking about them in particular. So I thought very much about Jonathan and his personality and his musicality and rigor and the discussions I've heard him do about Beethoven, and all those things are part of the music. Yeah.
Now that I hear you say that, I can remember that as part of the piece, that sort of intensity of it, and then how just excited Jonathan gets about everything that he talks about, and that was how the piece felt. There was a sort of drive in it, which of course is also Beethovenian as well. Now, one of the things that you do is you sort of often bridge between like what we call pop and classical music. In this sort of like improvisation versus written down role, like what do you feel like we should be, how do I put this? Basically, should classical musicians be less, I don't want to use the word elitist because I don't think that's actually what most classical musicians are, maybe less ignorant of pop music?
Everyone should know way more about music than we do. And I think that goes for all people of all genres, except for certain people on the internet who do seem to have a wide range of knowledge. There's so much music out there, and I think it's weird that a lot of us in quote unquote classical music kind of grew up only knowing certain things. I love the overlaps. I love the differences. I think about great songwriting is great songwriting. I love the non sequiturs, the interesting shifts that happen in certain kinds of pop music. And we should just know more about each other as humans in the world. And there are a lot of people for whom a certain kind of music or a certain artist or a certain album is really important. And if, that knowing more about that is also sort of knowing more about that person. So, that's my feeling. I am so ignorant. There's so many things that I don't know. So I'm just going to spend the rest of my life playing catch up and learning about them. But when I write music, I don't shy away from my love of certain pop music. Great songwriters, Beatles, of course, but even sort of, I won't say what I think is a trashy current pop song, but trashy current pop songs, and what is actually satisfying about that? Where does it hit? What changed about the chord progression here? What changed about the timbre? What was the pacing? Why did it lift and fall there? And those are all deeply musical, interesting things to play with. Yeah.
Sublime. And so we stay on borrowed time.
I'm sure you've seen that video of the Pachelbel rant guy, this guitarist who plays. Have you ever seen this?
I don't think so.
Well, it's a guy who goes through basically 24 pop songs that all use the same chord progression.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think there's been other people who've done it, and it's really funny. And I mean, of course, there is some truth in it that there is a sort of formula for pop music. There is a similar formula for, say, I think Mozart does it in a more creative way than some of these artists did, but there is a formula. I remember reading an interview with Bernstein where he said, how many times do you think Mozart wrote bum, 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 bum in his career? It's got to be over 1,000, right? There's a formula. there's a rhythmic formula that he uses all the time. And I find it really interesting. I'm pathetically ignorant about pop music, and, only certain songs will sort of filter into me. And I'm sometimes surprised. There is an image you get of, all the pop songs have the same chord progression, they're all the same. They're really not. And there's some really wonderful songwriters out there that are doing really great stuff. And I do wish that, myself included, we just would get to know these things a little bit better and as you said, learn from each other about this music.
Yeah, it's kind of all about just finding more things in the world to love. Yeah. When I think about sort of the difference between, I've done a little bit of songwriting and, little stuff in the pop world, and the sort of difference in my approach to the composition of those is in the song, I'm operating on a 3.5 to 4 to 5 minute time scale max. And there's only so much you can do in 3.5, 4 minutes. Whereas a piece of concert classical music that is going to be played on a certain series, you can operate in 8 to 25 minutes. And there are a lot of other things you can do. So, and also just working with notated music, the ability to change harmony and do certain sort of more specific technical things. I enjoy that, but there's also something really great about, a great 4-minute song.
I won't include this. Do you want to talk about Kanye West at all, or not really?
Oh, I can do a little bit. We're not really in touch anymore.
Well, I was wondering about it, but I think it's such an interesting connection with what we're talking about. And I wasn't planning to bring him up at all.
No, I used to be very touchy about it, but now I'm, I have some perspective. It's okay.
Right. Presidential candidate Kanye West.
Presidential candidate, yeah. He's also been a presidential candidate. I think that was not a surprise. He talked to me about that in 2015. So it's definitely been on the table for a long time. Working with, I super enjoyed it. I will say that honestly. I've learned a lot, not just, from him, but a lot of the other producers in the room, and it's a world of music making that I did not know about. and to be a part of it on a really on the deep level. Not just, I think some people think that maybe I kind of like arrange some, sort of classical version of this stuff. It's like, no, it's actually really being in the room in Wyoming, working in a studio. And I like it. I like the sort of immediacy of decision making. I don't know exactly how I'm saying that. I think Kanye works in a way of like, do I like that sound or not? Like, does that hit me in a certain way? And then thinking about the sort of concept of combining certain sounds or certain people, or certain artists, or certain sound musical worlds, and what that can mean for the music. And I think it's really interesting. Politically, we diverged very far in 2016, so that's difficult to talk about. But
yeah, it's sort of tragic and bizarre to witness what he's up to at the moment. But yeah, I mean, that's separating the man from the music in a way for the moment anyway. Just talking about your music again, one of the things that I find really interesting about it is, especially compared to a lot of modern Western classical music, it's very clean, and it's even kind of bare sometimes in its orchestration. You don't write all the time. I mean, in general, I think your music is not unbelievably dense. There's not a million things going on at once. And actually, I kind of find that sometimes more challenging because there's not a place to hide inside of all of this action going on. And I was reading another interview that you gave where you talked about that you don't mind having habits because you kind of notice something that you like about your own writing. Do you think that kind of clarity and spareness in your orchestration is like a habit, or is it a hat that you've just been trying on and you might try something else later? Or how does that fit in your mind?
My sense is that the spareness is is intuitive, and is sort of how I listen, and it's related probably to a lot of the orchestral music that I've loved, which is a lot of Mozart. Honestly, we're just the essentials are there. It's very spare, and everything it's there for a reason. There's also a feeling I've had as an orchestral player of, sometimes it's frustrating to be playing, 30-second sextuplets underneath a wave of brass. Like, no one's going to hear me do this. And I mean, it's not just it's not just modern music. It's like Debussy. It's like, hey, man, rebel. It's like, I'm working really hard here, and I appreciate the beauty on the page and the depth and the intricacy, but also I'm a human being, and I think about the players in an orchestra, like they probably have kids. They would like to spend time with their kids. They don't need to spend 2 hours to learn my awkward sextuplet figure. So let's just decide if that needs to be. But I also love, in a lot of pop, there is some pop music where the elements are super clear. And I hear that in a lot of, I think, hip hop of the last 10 years, as it's gone much more from sort of its early years into the pop world, where elements are very spare. If you listen to sometimes I think about like Drake songs or Billie Eilish, where the elements are incredibly clear, but incredibly important. So those building blocks mean something, and you hear them in a certain way. So then when you color it with the oboe, or you color it with the clarinet, or it's there and it's heard and it's meaningful. But I also want that music to be enjoyable for the players to play, rather than being kind of a cog in a wheel. Yeah. I don't think that I always do that, and I think I'm guilty of making players cogs in a wheel in a way that I don't love. But sometimes you just need that ostinato underneath.
I remember in Aspen, I was playing. We were reading the Tannhäuser Overture, and David Zinman called from the back of the orchestra to the concertmaster, who was David Halen from St. Louis Symphony, and he said, "David, could you teach everyone how to fake this, please?" And, you know, I thought to myself, like, what's the point? You know, like, why am I doing this? You know, because he said, you know, nobody's ever going to hear it. And it's, you know, and he taught us how to fake it. There was actually a technique of how to fake that passage in Tannhäuser.
Yeah.
You know, so whatever. It's just the way it is.
I appreciate the honesty about that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Just one last question about your music, which is, you talk a lot about the connection between speech and song, and speech and singing, and it's sort of a little bit like a modern look at like Sprechstimme of Schoenberg. Oh, yeah. Can you talk about why you find that relationship so interesting?
Oh, maybe it's also related to how I think of a lot of music as conversation, and speech, and the relationship to speech and the pace of conversation is sometimes how I like to construct, you know, phrases or harmonic shifts or pacing in music. So that and this sort of thinking about shared language among people, but specifically what you're talking about, the relationship of speech to singing, has to do for me with like a style of singing or a technique of singing. I can easily go from speaking into singing just very quickly, like just pitching it just a little bit. And I also fully believe that when we're speaking, we are singing, obviously, and doing these incredibly complex things with the voice. But there's a lot of, I think, very direct folk and pop music that is in that, the singing is in that sort of pitched spoken place. Sorry, this is a very long, rambly answer to that.
Not at all. Not at all.
But it feels you know, satisfying and direct and honest and clear to me when I hear someone sing that way. And so I generally, even if I'm writing a song for another singer, I love having them sit even lower, even if it's a soprano, to sit in that lower, more speaky range, because the vowels are clear, the consonants are clear, and then you can stretch it up, and then it becomes singing in a way, in a different way.
And so just, I don't want to take too much more of your time. So what are you working on at the moment, if you can talk about it? And what are you working on at the moment?
Right now I am a bit late for a piece for a wonderful choir in Copenhagen. It's 12 voices. I also have a little bit of a film score that I'm working on. There's an opera in 2023. There's a bunch of songs I'm writing. String quartet's always in there. A big piece for New York Phil, A Room Full of Teeth. That's, if that can happen, next February. But the sort of non-commissioned project that I have been working on for a year and a half with this dancer in Vancouver. Her name is Vanessa Goodman, and it's a piece that is not dance, it's not theater, it's not just music, but it's something. It feels like a mysterious little hour-long jewel box of a piece. We don't know exactly what it is, but I'm excited about it.
That's great.
What about you? What are you excited about, Josh?
Well, I mean, basically the thing I've got on my plate is this Beethoven cycle, which is
huge.
Learning 9 symphonies in 3 months, which,
oh my gosh,
you know, I've done all of them except for number 8 in concert. So, you know, they're all sort of bringing them back, but it's still like to learn all of them at the same time and we don't know if we're going to be able to do number 9 because of all the restrictions with choirs, but, you know, obviously you have to be ready for it. And it's sort of, I've been really enjoying it because just to get a sense of the whole board, seeing the whole board in a way, and seeing actually one of the things I've just been so struck by, everybody talks about Beethoven as like this, you know, the defiance and the resistance and triumph over deafness and everything, which is all there, of course, but also how funny his music is. And, you know, he doesn't get enough credit for his sort of Haydn on steroids humor, I think. Where, you know, every symphony has a funny moment. I mean, 5 doesn't really have anything funny, but almost every symphony has something funny in it. And I think that's really something that I just never really noticed is present in everything. I knew it was in his early stuff, but I never sort of saw the whole process of that.
Yeah, I think humor is the thing that it's hard to translate over centuries, but it's there. I'm sure he was. That's really interesting. I can't wait to hear this.
Yeah, I think it's like he was famous for like telling all these dirty jokes and stuff, and so his jokes aren't like wholesome jokes like Haydn, where it's like, oh, haha, he had the strings tuned there, string down. It's like that's very cute. Like the Beethoven's humor, it feels like it's a little nasty. But it's so, everything in Beethoven's so raw and energetic, especially in the symphony. So that's been a really fun discovery. And that's basically, so I'm doing that, and I'm doing another Beethoven symphony in October, along with the Entr'acte, your Entr'acte. Mm-hmm. And then in November, we'll see what happens. Probably things will be canceled, but we're not sure yet.
We'll see.
Yeah, but anyway, thank you so much for doing this. It was such great to talk to you.
Clip and edit out the boring parts.
No, I will have very little to do with that. So thanks again for doing this, and hopefully we'll get to see each other soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you next week, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on iTunes. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And please send any questions you have to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @Sticky Notes Podcast. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/Sticky Notes Podcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.
Will we exist at all, my love, or will we fade to stanzas of the dust that I suppose is all we were and all we'll